Unit VCS03 Lesson 1 Principles and Practices of Animal Handling and Care in the Veterinary Environment. Aims and objectives of this session are to cover Learning Outcome 1 aspects. 1A. You need to understand the requirements for animal accommodation within veterinary practice to include dog and/or cat and/or other animal. So to cover the general species that you would encounter in daily practice. 1B. You would need to be able to describe appropriate hygiene protocols for veterinary practice accommodation. It is also really important you have an awareness of procedures that are in place for this. And 1C, determine the fixtures and fittings for a range of commonly seen animals in veterinary practice. So you need to be able to maintain accommodation for common species within a veterinary care environment. So what is involved? Preparation is really key. So if you use an organised approach, that will really assist you to carry out the task. Get yourself organised and prepared with all the equipment and materials that you're going to need. And this could include the following: preparing your cleaning products, so making up the disinfectant you're going to be using to the correct dilution if it's not already a prepared product that you use. It's really vital that you wear and get prepared the PPE that you're going to need to wear. That's going to depend on the type of case that you're dealing with as to whether you're dealing with what would be classed as a healthy or an infectious animal, but also in general to protect you from the sorts of cleaning products that you're using as well. So it's vital that you wear gloves and aprons and potentially also eye protection when making up your disinfectant product to prevent you being harmed by that. Some will be irritants, so it's certainly very important to bear that in mind, that it's not only to protect yourself from the animal's state, but it's also to protect yourself from the products that you're using. So if you can get your PPE ready to wear in preparation, that's really helpful. Very often you may need to utilise other accommodation or temporary accommodation for the animal to be housed in while you're cleaning out its mainstay accommodation. So you need to get that prepared and make sure that's clean and safe and secure. Obviously, you're going to be removing any soiled bedding, soiled substrate and things like that from the kennel. So you need to have all of the clean and fresh items ready to hand, so that as soon as the kennel is prepared and ready to go, you can pop those items back in, ready for the animal to be placed back into that environment. So what personal protective equipment can be used and should be used? It can consist of disposable gloves, aprons, face masks, goggles, shoe covers, boiler suits and overalls. And as we've already said, this is personal protective equipment, so it's designed to protect yourself but also the patients in your care, and it's going to act as a protective barrier to both sides of that. By wearing such PPE, it's going to help to prevent the spread of infection, along with other procedures that are in place, such as your Who hand rub technique or your Who hand washing technique. PPE is really vital in relation to infection control. So it's not something that is just there to be used if we feel like using it today. It's something that should be used day in, day out for those daily tasks, however mundane and straightforward they may seem. That is the reason for it being provided. And your employer has to provide you with the appropriate personal protective equipment as part of their health and safety requirements and their remit and responsibilities in relation to that. But it's also your responsibility to make sure that you wear it. Cleaning equipment. So what does it consist of? We can think that there are, routine things that we will use day in, day out, and they are things such as the following. So mops and mop heads, mop buckets, cloths, bowls, bottles, sprays, jugs for appropriate dilution of cleaning agents, steam cleaners, brooms, dustpan and brush, hoovers, It's going to depend on the area that you are going to be cleaning, and what you should have within your practice is designated items for different areas. So for example, we wouldn't want to be using the same broom, dustpan and brush, mop head and bucket in our kennels area as we would do in our reception. The same applies that we wouldn't use the same equipment for in our theatre as our reception as well. So you should be using the appropriately designated items, and if you are unsure of this, it is really important that you ask. You shouldn't just be using any old mop and bucket in an area if you don't know that it is designated for that particular area of the practice. So make yourself familiar with this sort of information. Consider what should be being used in those sorts of situations. Obviously, we also need some health and safety signage as well. So, for example, if we're going to be mopping a floor in an area, make sure that you pop up the wet floor sign so that we are not only protecting ourselves, but other members of the team and also members of the public and our clients. Holding tanks or cages. So these are going to act as a temporary accommodation for the animal. So whilst we're cleaning out their own accommodation, we should never be cleaning accommodation with the animal in there because we could cause them harm. We're using disinfectant sprays, removing items, and it would also be quite a scary, potentially process for an animal to remain within their accommodation while we're doing what we need to do. So they need to be housed safely and securely so that we can clean that accommodation appropriately. Obviously, within that holding tank or cage, again, we need to provide them with appropriate substrate or bedding materials. And before putting them into that accommodation, as with any accommodation, we must be checking that it's safe for use and fit for purpose prior to using it. So making sure that there's no sharp edges, loose aspects that could cause an animal to escape, injure themselves. Checking all of that before use is vitally important. And again, that holding tank or cage will then need to be cleaned in between uses. So we don't just use it and then forget about that. The process needs to continue along for then that to be cleaned as well. Correct use of dilution rates. This is of great importance. We need to consider the area of the practice, our patients' health and safety of ourselves, and also of our clients and members of the public. In relation to our patients, we need to consider their actual health status and why we're using the disinfectant that we are using. It will vary between cleaning an area housing a healthy animal versus that of cleaning the accommodation of an animal with infectious or contagious diseases. So, for example, an isolation ward accommodating a patient with feline FIV would need a stronger dilution rate. So, for example, a dilution rate of 1 to 50 is quite common. Whereas if we were just using accommodation cleaner or disinfectant to clean our consulting room, for example, we'd probably only dilute that product, even if it were the same product, to 1 to 100. So we can see there's quite a vast difference there. It's really important that we follow manufacturer's instructions and make up disinfectants to the correct dilution rate. Otherwise, it's not going to have the desirable effect we need it to have. So, for instance, if we use the rate of 1 to 100 in the accommodation ward with that animal with feline FIV, it's not going to be a strong enough dilution rate to be able to target that disease appropriately. Thus, it's not going to kill such harmful things that we have in our environment. We need to measure out accordingly using something such as a measuring jug, or sometimes you will have your larger disinfectant containers with a system that measures it out for you so that it's accurate. We can follow the information on the packaging on the container of the product, and we can also use the accompanying data sheets. Also, obviously, be aware of the procedures that you have in place and the cost risk assessments associated to it, so that you're using it safely and making it up safely, and make sure that you're utilising the PPE that's provided in relation to it. Another reason for using the correct dilution rate is so that we're not going to make products more harmful, so that actually it is detrimental to patient or human health. we need to consider that obviously these chemicals sometimes need some time to remain in the kennel, so actually a contact time for them to work appropriately, but also the fact that sometimes they can be quite strong smelling and things like that, and we wouldn't want to be producing harmful vapours by having an over-the-top dilution rate. This is going to be detrimental rather than a positive use. So this sort of dilution rate is really important, and if you're unsure of where to find such information, then you can consult the packaging as stated, and you can speak to your qualified members of the team. So use and storage of cleaning and disinfection solutions. So correct use relates to the correct dilution rate, contact time in that accommodation and area, and also required wash down if required. So this is following manufacturer's instructions. So some disinfectants will require for you to wash down the area with water afterwards. Others don't need for you to do that. So we need to make sure that we follow those instructions at all time and not just do what we think. So storage is per manufacturer's instructions. So this is an example I've taken from Safe 4. So it states, handling and storage. Precautions for safe handling. Avoid all contact. Good hygiene practices and housekeeping measures. Do not eat, drink or smoke when using this product. So make sure that you're wearing PPE would be vital when using this product. In relation to conditions for safe storage, you need to keep it in the original container only. Keep that container tightly closed and in a well ventilated place. Make sure that the product is stored at room temperature. Ensure that it's not going to freeze. And make sure that you are maintaining the storage life by keeping it at that ambient temperature. Incompatible materials that it could not be housed with would be acids. And we also need to keep it away from oxidising agents. So that's just an example of one disinfectant, and that information would again be on the data sheet relating to it and also on the packaging of the container. And again, such information should be in your SOPs and also your COSH risk assessment. Full clean versus spot clean. A full clean is what it says on the tin. It's going to require a full clean out of the accommodation. We're going to remove the animal into temporary, safe and secure accommodation. We're going to remove the organic materials such as animal waste, such as faeces or any urine contaminated paper, for example, and that's going to go into our waste bin. And that is going to be categorised depending on the type of patient that you're dealing with. So whether they're infectious or contagious, whether they're classed as healthy. And you would follow your practices protocol for how that waste is disposed of. So whether it's into offensive waste, for example, or hazardous waste. And again, that's going to be depending on the patient's health status. And that is going to mean that we remove things such as newspaper, shavings, sawdust, obviously depending on the patient's species. Mechanical cleaning is of real importance. So without having done this, what we could do later on will be really affected. So if we don't carry out mechanical or physical cleaning, we're not going to make very much of a difference. So we're going to remove any solid materials such as dried on waste, such as fecal matter, etc. Mop up any of the fluids, remove hair using a dustpan and brush or hoover, and then actually physically scrub the accommodation. And that's going to help to remove a large amount of the microorganisms. So actually still leaving waste matter in the kennel and simply spraying or applying a disinfectant liquid to it is going to actually affect how effective the disinfectant is. And we want it to be as effective as possible. We want it to kill what it states on the packaging that it's going to kill. So all of these stages are really vital beforehand. Then once we've actually mechanically or physically cleaned the kennel, we can then apply using a cloth the correctly diluted disinfectant product. Again, physically scrub all of the surfaces of the accommodation, including doors, bars, hinges, lids, roofs, sides and bases. And then we allow the correct contact time, and that's going to be dependent on the disinfectant and the manufacturer's instructions. We may also then need to rinse down with water before drying, and ideally then leaving to air dry is the most appropriate, so that kennel has a good air out in the process as well. So depending on your practice protocol and also your patient and their health status, this would most certainly be carried out at least once daily with a spot clean throughout the day as required. And that needs to be completed between each patient that occupies the accommodation. And a spot clean is just that. So cleaning a spot that has become contaminated there and then. So for example, when an animal has urinated in the kennel, removing that matter straight away, replacing the bedding, incontinence pads and newspaper, for example. And that's when we don't need a full clean, but actually doing that minor spot clean will be more than sufficient. In relation to cleaning out accommodation of small mammals, this may vary from their dog and cat counterparts. So in relation to their care at home, it is quite normal for them to have just a full clean once a week rather than a full clean once daily. And that then on a daily basis, spot cleaning would take place as appropriate. And that is generally because of the amount of substrate that they would have in their accommodation, and it is quite unpractical unless really required to change that and replace it each day. It's also quite stressful for the animal because they are generally delicate animals, to keep removing them from their accommodation to do a full clean. Obviously, consideration of any animal species housed within the veterinary environment needs to be considered and planned appropriately as to whether we would change things in relation to these sorts of animals. So it is normal practice for dog and cat accommodation to have a full clean once daily and then spot cleaning throughout the day. But it might be that we move it to every couple of days in relation to our small animal patients, so that we're not causing undue stress or strain on them, but that we're ensuring that their accommodation is clean, and obviously consideration of their particular condition is vitally important too. There are occasions where normal protocols or routines won't be appropriate when it comes to cleaning accommodation. We wouldn't want to, prior to or after an animal having given birth, interrupt her and her offspring. We would need to give her time and space prior to giving birth, and any changes of routine to that animal at that point can be quite distressing and could have a negative and counterproductive effect. When mom is in the early stages of caring for her offspring, so when she's first producing milk for them, it is of utmost importance that again we don't interfere with that stage. It's really important within the first 48 hours that the mom is able to provide the offspring with the colostrum, so we wouldn't disturb the animal at this time. Immediately after surgery during recovery, a spot clean is usually more relevant at that point in time, as and when required only, but the animal should be placed into clean accommodation to recover in. When an animal is near to death, would be another situation where we would not want to clean the accommodation. We would not want to cause any unnecessary stress or strain to the patient at that point in time. Keeping them as comfortable and as happy as possible would be vitally important. And again, if necessary, a spot clean would be all that we would do at this point in time. Replenishment of bedding and substrate. Types, amounts and suitability. So once the accommodation has been allowed to dry, it is then necessary to set up the accommodation ready for the animal to return to it. What I would like you to do is complete the following task. I would like for you to research the required bedding and substrate required for the following species: dog, cat, rabbit, guinea pig, and also an overview of rodents. You can use the e-resources available to you, your textbooks, and what I would like for you to cover is what the most appropriate type of bedding is, not just what you may think is appropriate, but what is classed as being appropriate, the most appropriate type of substrate, and consider why animals are in veterinary practice rather than their home environment and how that substrate may differ from normal. and also the general amounts to be used and the reasons for this. And this will help to build upon any existing knowledge that you may have regarding different species and apply it to the future patients that you encounter in your practice. Waste disposal is very important, and it's important that you follow your own practices protocol relating to waste disposal. Different waste companies will provide different waste disposal products. Generally, such waste would be classified into the following: hazardous waste, non-hazardous waste, deceased animals, and body parts. You can use the link provided below to print off the BVA Good Guide to Waste Disposal, and keep that in your folder as it will relate to various aspects throughout your qualification. But also have a look at your own practice waste disposal and any information you have from your own waste disposal company. Very often they will provide their own posters to be able to inform members of the team, and also such information could be put into practice procedures. So make sure you're aware of how your own waste disposal is categorised and the correct names of such waste disposal as well. Cleaning and maintenance of accommodation and equipment and bedding. On completing a full clean of the animal accommodation, we also need to check the accommodation is fit for purpose. We must make sure that it's safe for our animal to be housed within there, so there must be no damage having been caused to it. We must look out for aspects such as sharp edges, cracks, any animal inflicted damage, and also make sure that the accommodation would be secure, so checking that locking mechanisms are working as they should be. When removing all items from the accommodation, the bedding will also be removed, and that must be washed unless we're using disposable bedding, and we usually do that at 60 degrees Celsius or as per your practice protocol. All equipment such as food bowls, water bottles, and enrichment aspects such as hides, toys, and other items will also need to be cleaned, removing any food debris, animal waste, for example, initially, and then cleaning using the appropriate disinfectant. Again, that needs to have been safely diluted, rinsing thoroughly after disinfection, and ready to be used again. Feeding and watering regimes. In veterinary practice, you're going to need to undertake the feeding and watering regimes for the common species that you would encounter in your environment, and this will link to your e-portfolio. We need basic feeding and watering equipment. This includes utensils, bowls, water bottles, and we need to be aware of the cleaning and storage of such items. Types of food that you will need to be able to provide will be fresh, whether that be foraged or meat, dried, and these would include concentrates, complete foods, and preserved forages, tinned to include meats and fish, frozen. You may also potentially deal with raw feeding for cats and dogs. However, that is up to practice protocol, and it would also need to be stored accordingly and safely. You'll be dealing with quality feeds and also feeds that the owner will provide from home, so this can vary. You need to be storing food correctly, checking shelf life, longevity, and also making sure that you're using within the best before dates. You need to have a consideration of the dietary requirements of animals, so their size, weight, age, activity levels, species, and the amount for each animal. And it's really important in practice that we're very aware of malnutrition occurring. We do not want to be underfeeding animals. We need to make sure that they're receiving the correct amount of kilocalories. And also we do not want to be contributing to obesity. We need to make sure that we're sticking to routine when it comes to number of feeds, as long as the patient's condition allows for that, and that we're feeding frequently enough. Having an idea of the appropriate feeding times in relation to number of feeds is also really important. You need to be able to prepare animal feed, deliver that feed to animals, sometimes feed groups rather than just individuals, and check that they're eating and how they're getting on when it comes to eating and note any signs of difficulty. You need to clean feeding utensils and equipment in between use. Store all of the equipment appropriately. Make sure that animals have got water available at all times unless it is required that they do not have access to water, such as just prior to surgery. Provide fresh water where appropriate, and again make sure that cleaning of water and equipment occurs, and that's particularly relevant to dropper bottles that are used for our small animal species, making sure there's no build-up of algae in such a container. You must store food correctly. You must dispose of food left by animals. Dispose of food that's out of date, anything that is mouldy or has been open for a prolonged period of time. And you must have an understanding of how to reduce or prevent any pest or vermin problems. Feeding and watering equipment used for dogs and cats. We must provide food and water to the individual species in the most suitable format. Dogs and cats require food and water bowls. They may be either ceramic, we class these as being heavy and durable, but they can be more difficult to clean and can be easily broken. Stainless steel is easy to clean, very durable, and can also be autoclaved or plastic. Is another option. This can be cheap to buy, comes in various shapes, however it can be chewed and damaged by our patients. We wouldn't want to be providing water to cats in a stainless steel bowl. They do not like being able to see their reflection, so we tend to use ceramic or china potentially as well for our cat patients, and ceramic or stainless steel for our dogs. Any utensils used for preparing feed should only be used for animals and should be appropriately disinfected and stored between uses. Feeding and watering equipment for small mammals. Small mammals ideally require heavy ceramic bowls or equivalent alternatives, and also, if used, a water bottle to provide water to them safely. Again, as with cats and dogs, any utensils should be used for animal use only. Items used for feeding purposes should be cleaned daily and stored safely between use. Types of food is very key for you to be aware of. We can talk about fresh, foraged or meat, and this can include fresh meat if that is utilised in veterinary practice. Generally, we would relate it to the use of chicken when providing a bland diet. However, an appropriate complete diet is the most appropriate choice. As we have touched on, some veterinary practices now do need to be aware of raw feeding, as quite a lot of our general public would now be utilising this means of feeding their animals. However, practices must follow strict procedures for the storage, preparation and feeding of such products to ensure that all involved in the process are kept safe. We can also talk about forage in relation to plants or parts of plants, and that's going to include aspects such as hay. For example, the provision of this for our rabbits is particularly important. It helps to provide them with the appropriate amount of roughage for their diet needs, and that is due to the cellulose that's provided within the hay. We can also provide dried food, so concentrates, complete foods and preserved forages. And generally we will be using veterinary prescription diets or veterinary recommended products. We use them because they provide a balanced diet. Preserved forages come in the form of packaged hay, so for example, hay that's been treated to ensure that it is very safe for use. Preserved and treated to ensure that the animal is going to receive a really high quality of hay. Tinned, that can include meats or fish, or frozen, and appropriate for use with animals that are not familiar with dry formats of food, but again must be of high quality. Frozen foods are not utilised very often with small mammals. It's more relevant for our exotic species. Quality of feed. We should be using a high quality complete diet to ensure that they contain all the necessary nutrients that are vital for a balanced diet. Correct storage. That's vital to ensure that the food is maintained in the most appropriate manner to ensure it maintains its shelf life. Shelf life, longevity and best before dates of feedstuffs. So all food provided should be within their stated best before date so that they are appropriate and safe for use. Dietary requirements of animals. Consider that animals' size, weight, age, activity levels, etc. can have quite a bearing on this. And it's really key that we are feeding them appropriately, maintaining their calorific requirements so that we're not going to have animals that are becoming malnourished whilst in our care, but also not overfeeding them. So we must ensure that we feed them the appropriate amount of food, and we mustn't over or underfeed. And this can include actually weighing out the feedstuffs, especially in relation to dry food formats, to ensure that we are meeting that calorific requirement. If we're using complete or tin diets, we can follow the guides provided on the food packaging, so as per the manufacturer's guidelines, and feed according to the animal's size and weight and body condition score. We don't just feed for the animal's weight, we do need to consider their size and what their body condition score is as to whether, whilst they are in our care at that point in time, they are fitting into the body condition score that they should be, i.e. are they underweight? Do we need to up that calorific requirement? Are they where they should be, so we just maintain their normal calorific intake? Or are they overweight, so we actually need to adjust this and tweak it so that we start to reduce that weight? And the amount of food we need to feed is going to rely on how calorie dense the food is. So if we use our manufacturer's instructions, so not only on our tinned foods, on our complete diets as well, that will assist us. And we must feed an accurate amount, so weighing it out using scales, using appropriate veterinary prescription containers to measure it out accordingly. We shouldn't just guesstimate it. And we must also consider the animal's age and return that life stage feeding, and also how that can have a bearing. What I would like you to do is, using the available e-resources and any textbooks that you have, I would like you to research and just make a note of how nutritional requirements vary depending on the animal's age and life stages. So I'd like you to have a look at that of the puppy, kitten or young animal, pregnant or lactating animal, active or working animal, and that of an elderly animal, and see how we would adjust according to those life stages. I would like for you to produce some notes about that could be uploaded onto one file. You can mind map, however you want to lay it out, but just to show that you've researched and taken on board how that can vary depending on life stage, and then your veterinary educationist can have a look at that. Number of feeds and frequency of feeding. So we must consider the reason that the animal is being fed and also a reason for being hospitalised. Some patients are going to require more feeds than others. So for example, a cat with a feeding tube that has been placed may require 5 or more feeds of liquid food each day, whereas a diabetic dog will need to have its normal routine maintained. So for example, if it eats at home twice daily, this would need to be adhered to. And you can communicate with your qualified team about the importance of number of feeds and the frequency of it. We should, where possible, consider and follow the normal feeding pattern of dogs and cats. They are very different in their eating behaviours. So dogs will generally eat all food offered to them there and then. That is what we would class as a pack animal behaviour, whereas cats, due to their hunting behaviours, will generally consume some of the meal and then come back to it later to continue to feed. So we call them a grazer. And it's suggested that such species are fed at least twice daily. Once daily feeding is thought to cause an overload of the stomach, and that can cause regurgitation. And fresh water should be available at all times, unless the animal's condition or research or tests are taking place that would mean that that weren't appropriate. We must consider the species of the animal. So again, rabbits are grazers and will potentially spend most of their time eating. That's very similar to what they would do in the wild. So we provide them with hay, complete pellets and fresh vegetables daily, along with fresh water, and that's vitally important. Rats and mice, for example, are best fed small amounts at a time, as they can be very selective in their eating. Again, they must have water provided at all times. Feeding times. Preparation of animal feed must be considered. We need to use good hygiene. So our personnel, our staff in our practice must be of good personal hygiene. And that must be taken on board when we're preparing such food. So hands must be clean prior to preparing any food. And also the area where the food is being prepared must be clean and tidy. All utensils relating to food provision must also be clean and hygienic. We don't want to be responsible for contaminating the food. That's vitally important. And how we actually deliver or provide the animals with the feed. We should approach the accommodation calmly and in a soothing manner. Make the animal aware of our approach and our presence. Also, prior to this, make sure that you are aware of the animal's temperament and also behaviour towards feeding times. Some animals can be have an aggressive tendency when it comes to feed and be quite territorial. So having knowledge on this can help you prepare that feed appropriately and also provide it to the animal safely. Many animals, particularly dogs and cats, can become very excited by it. So feeding individuals and groups, consider that dogs being fed in groups can potentially lead to fighting. So regarding feeding, and one will exert dominance. This isn't all that applicable to veterinary practice. We generally have dogs in as individual animals. However, it might be a situation that you encounter. And if we need to, then we could feed those animals in separate areas. That also means that we get to ensure that they eat the correct quantity of food, that they're having the correct diet that's relevant to them as an individual. If they can't be separated, then we must monitor them closely. Checking that animals are eating through observation is really important. Some animals, however, are quite private about this, and particularly cats is a species that are private, so it might need to be done from a distance. And sometimes they won't eat when we are around. They will come back to it when a room is empty or at certain times of the day. And food and water intake must be recorded on the patient's hospitalisation record. And again, that's so important in relation to having weighed out food and water intake where that applies, so that we know actually how much they've taken on board. Cleaning feeding utensils and equipment must be disinfected and cleaned thoroughly after use, rinsed and dried. As we've said, storage of the utensils and equipment store in a clean and dry environment. Check that water is available, so frequently throughout the day we must ensure that water is available for patients and record that water intake and replenish it where appropriate. And certainly when it comes to providing fresh water, the minimum of at least once, if not twice daily in a clean receptacle is most certainly appropriate, but you will probably find that you will actually provide water replenishment more regularly than that. And again, cleaning water equipment is really important. In summary, during this session we have covered Learning Outcome 1, 1A, 1B and 1C. And this has been covered through means of the video and research tasks completed by yourselves to be marked by your veterinary education list. And this will also link to your e-portfolio.